Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder, violence, and trauma. Listener discretion is advised.
A big manhunt underway for 6 convicted murderers who broke out of a state prison in Mecklenburg County, Virginia during the night. The inmates were all on death row. The 6 overpowered guards with homemade knives had drove out with a prison van.
All right, let's pick up exactly where we left off. A prison van had just rolled through the front gates of Mecklenburg Correctional Center and disappeared into the night. Not a guard's personal vehicle, not a visitor's vehicle. No, this was a state vehicle. White, plain, almost forgettable, except for what it carried. 6 condemned men, now known in the media as the Mecklenburg Six. Men the Commonwealth of Virginia had already decided would die in an electric chair. And in 1984, once that van was gone, it wasn't like you could just pull up its location on a phone, ping a GPS signal, or scroll through a live feed of updates. There were no alerts, no push notifications, no sharing of social media posts. There was just a growing circle of sirens, radio, and fear, moving faster than the truth ever could. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the real Appalachia. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Now, the escape itself was shocking, but what came after, the manhunt, that's where this story really settles in. Because an escape is one moment, but a manhunt is days of not knowing. It's the kind of not knowing that creeps into kitchens, onto back porches, and into the shadows. And for Smith County, Virginia, the place where Lem Tuggle's name was already a scar, the news of the escape felt close. It felt like something was coming back home. Before we get in too deep, I want to do something a little different. I'm going to tell you about how law enforcement thought about this manhunt, because I had the privilege to speak with a retired Smith County Sheriff's Office deputy who was there in 1984, and what he told me was simple, practical, and honestly, it was chilling in its calm. He said from the moment they were notified of the escape, they were focused on one place, Lem Tuggle's mother's house. Not because they had proof he was coming there. Not because they saw someone strange in the neighborhood. Not because someone had called in a tip. No, it was the one place that made sense to them, if Lem came back at all. And the deputy said they kept it under constant surveillance and formed a radius around it, watching and monitoring. The kind of watching that isn't dramatic to look at, but it changes the way you breathe when you're the one doing it. I asked him why the house was their focus, when the prison itself was more than 200 miles away. And he said, because people run back to what they know. They run back to family. They run back to the places where they think they can disappear, deep into the familiar woods and along back roads. And sometimes they want to return to the scene of the crime. He said they were watching those 2 areas as well, where the bodies were found. Those locations, not surprisingly, were very close to each other. You see, here in Appalachia, roots matter, and not in a poetic way, just in the way real life works. Family names, old ties, dark hollers, places outsiders don't know how to pronounce and couldn't find, even if you drew them a map. So while the FBI and state police were building a perimeter near the North Carolina line over 200 miles away, Smith County deputies were sitting on a house, waiting. And that waiting matters, because it's one of the reasons this manhunt changed people. It wasn't just because the shadow had escaped. It was the feeling that the shadow could walk right back through a familiar door. The first hours after the escape were organized chaos. The governor's office was notified. The Virginia State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigations was called into action. The prison had to account for hostages. The FBI was now involved. And the one thing on everyone's mind, that every minute that passed, the bigger the search area would become. Here's what we know from reports. The escape happened late at night on May 31st, 1984. The men drove out in a van about 10:47 p.m. and crossed into North Carolina. The van was later found abandoned in Warrenton, North Carolina, near a schoolyard. By the time authorities realized the van had been abandoned, they also had realized something else. The 6 men weren't staying together. And that's what makes a manhunt harder. One group means one trail. 6 groups mean 6 possibilities. 6 sets of hands reaching for rides, food, clothes, weapons, and shelter. And the list of who escaped? It mattered. Because this just wasn't 32-year-old Lem Tuggle Jr. that was on the run. This was also the Briley brothers, 30-year-old Linwood and 28-year-old James, names that, even at the time, carried national weight. Sentenced to death for murdering 11 people in Richmond, Virginia. They were considered the most violent. 30-year-old Earl Clanton Jr., sentenced to death for murdering an elementary school librarian. 32-year-old Derick Peterson, sentenced to death for robbing and murdering a grocery store manager. And 34-year-old Willie Leroy Jones, sentenced to death for killing 3 people. 6 men convicted of killing a total of 17 people. And that's just convicted. 6 men with nothing to lose. And that is one thing that bothered the authorities. The wondering of what lengths these men would go to stay free. The lingering question, would they kill again? And with those thoughts, the manhunt was no longer just about capturing fugitives. It was about stopping the next crime before it happened. Now you can see why there was panic in the surrounding states near the prison. Maybe even the East Coast. Maybe even the whole country. Because news like that, news of that many violent offenders on the run, that's something you just can't ignore. Now back home in Smith County, as the news reports continue to flow in, sporadically, almost cryptic, a radio bulletin here, a phone call there, a neighbor who'd heard something from someone who knew someone at the sheriff's office. You know how that goes. And when that name, Lem Tuggle, came back into the air, it didn't matter that Mecklenburg was far away. It didn't matter that logic said he could be heading anywhere. Fear isn't logical. Fear is historical. People began remembering the dance. People began remembering the trial. People remember what it felt like to realize a monster wasn't a stranger. He was somebody from the same county. So the county changed almost overnight. The residents of this rural county were living in fear. And I asked the deputy what it looked like around the county the next day. He said calls came in constantly. People saying they saw Lem in public places, at a convenience store, near a gas station, on the roadside. And he said, from a law enforcement standpoint, that didn't make sense to them. Because think about it. A wanted fugitive on a nationwide manhunt with his face all over the news. He's not stopping at a store to buy a pop. He's not standing around where everybody can get a good look at him. But the deputy said they still had to answer every call, because you can't tell a frightened community, that's probably nothing. Not when the last time they thought it was nothing, the girl didn't come home. So the county lived in this strange split reality. On one side, you had law enforcement working the logic, watching the mother's house, watching known places, thinking like a fugitive. On the other side, you had the community working the emotion, seeing them everywhere, even in their dreams. And on a personal note, I can remember when the escape happened. We didn't care about the others. We probably didn't even realize there was 5 more of them. We just cared about Lem. I remember not being allowed to go outside to play. I remember the fear that slowly crept in as the sun went down. I remember the phone calls we received and people sharing the latest sightings. And I remember the terror, the self-inflicting fear the mind of an 8-year-old can produce. And while Smith County was fielding fear, down in North Carolina, the hunt started turning real. Because on June 1st, The very next afternoon, 2 of the escapees were captured just 30 miles away in Warrenton, North Carolina, inside a laundromat. It's one of those details that sounds almost ridiculous until you realize what it means. These men had just walked out of death row. They were supposed to be running into the woods and hiding in caves. And yet, there they were, sitting in a laundromat, drinking wine and eating cheese. Reports describe officers noticing one of them wearing what looked like a correctional officer's jacket with the badges torn off. That's the kind of small, wrong detail that makes a good cop stop and look twice. Clanton and Peterson were taken back into custody within about 19 hours of the escape. And for a moment, there was a feeling of relief. 2 down and 4 still on the run. And among those 4 were the ones everyone feared the most, the Brileys, and the one Smith County feared in a different way, Lem Tuggle. Now the next piece of this story is where the manhunt widens into something national, because the remaining 4 just didn't hide out in the woods near the prison. They stole a pickup truck from a driveway in North Carolina, one that was easy to identify because of its personalized tag, PEL-1. That tag becomes a kind of haunting thread in this story. It's just a plate, just letters and numbers. But in a manhunt, details like that in a sighting become the difference between maybe and for sure. You can feel how the search changed once that truck was in play. It wasn't just look for a white prison van any longer. It was look for this specific truck with this specific tag. And still, days went by. No news of any more captures. The whole country is on edge. The Brileys have ties to Richmond, Philadelphia, and New York City. Willie Jones has ties to Richmond, and Lem Tuggle, well, we know where he has ties. Somewhere in those days, the manhunt became more than officers and roadblocks, because fugitives don't survive alone. Not for long. They need food. They need rides. They need phones. They need places to sleep. And every person they meet becomes a gamble. Some people help because they're fooled. Some because they're threatened. Some because they think they're helping somebody else entirely. And some, well, it's all about their roots. That's why the deputy's perspective matters so much. I asked him, how did you decide which sightings were worth further investigating? He told me something that sounds simple, but it's the heart of rural law enforcement. He said you listen for the parts that make sense, not the panic, not the drama, the parts that fit how a fugitive would actually move. Seeing Lem walking into a store? That's fear talking. Seeing a strange car near the family home? That gets your attention. A report near back roads, near abandoned buildings? That could be something. But he also told me this. Even when you know most sightings are false, you respond anyway. Because the one time you don't respond could be the one time it's real. The escape changed people in Smith County. Changed how they viewed safe. Changed how they viewed distance. And even today, people continue to lock their doors. Far from Virginia, far from the mountains that knew his name, Lem kept moving. Every mile put distance between him and Smith County, between him and the places people expected him to return to. The land was changing. The air felt different. Even the pace of life felt unfamiliar to him. And there was something else working against them, something no map prepares you for. Flies. Not just any flies, but black flies to be exact. Thick that time of year, relentless, biting, swarming anything that stayed too long. And Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones weren't passing through hotels or safe houses. They were camping in the woods, trying to stay hidden, trying to sleep outside, trying to survive. And if you don't know anything about black flies, they get into everything. Your ears, your eyes, your clothes. Their bites bleed, itch, and swell. They don't let up during the day, and they don't fully disappear at night. So, as the flies were on them, it made it harder to rest, harder to think clearly, harder to stay patient. It's not the kind of detail you usually hear in crime stories, but it matters. Because fugitives aren't moving through a movie set. They're dealing with real weather, real exhaustion, and small miseries that stack up until judgment slips. And then mistakes happen. And a mistake did happen. In a small rural town, Lem walked into a gift shop and robbed it at knife point. It wasn't a big score. Reports say it was about $80. $80. That's all it took to change everything. Because the clerk just didn't remember the robbery. She remembered the vehicle. And more importantly, she remembered the license plate. The same plate that had been echoing through law enforcement briefings for days. PEL-1. Once that tag was confirmed, this stopped being a guessing game. The search tightened. A state trooper and a local constable spotted the truck, moved in, and boxed it in. 10 days after the escape, Lem Tuggle surrendered. No shootout, no dramatic ending, just a quiet moment when his road finally ran out. And here's the part that sits heavy with me. While Smith County was bracing for his return, watching family homes, locking doors, wondering if he might come back to settle scores or disappear into the hills, Lem Tuggle was running in the opposite direction. At some point, he dropped the Briley brothers off. From there, he and Willie Jones were on their own. They weren't thinking short-term anymore. They were thinking about disappearing for good. They were headed for the border, Canada. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that if they made it across, they might never be sent back, that a death sentence wouldn't follow them there. They had been told that Canada wouldn't extradite a fugitive that was facing execution. And that belief carried them all the way north. The day after Tuggle was captured, Willie Jones turned himself in. Both men captured in Vermont, just a few miles from the Canadian border. That's a sentence that sounds simple, but imagine what it means. They were that close to crossing into a different country, into a different legal reality, into a place they believed might refuse to send them back. Lem gave up without a fight, and Willie turned himself in. There are different ways to interpret that: exhaustion, fear, realization. But the fact stands. By mid-June, Tuggle and Jones were back in custody. And then there were two, the Briley brothers. Now, the Brileys are a whole story on their own, and I'm not going to pretend we can fit all of them inside this episode. But we do need to understand why they mattered to the manhunt the way they did. Because for investigators, the Brileys weren't just two more fugitives. They were the ones everybody believed would kill again if given the chance. So law enforcement started looking at what they could control: patterns, contacts, phone logs. Reports at the time described investigators pivoting to death row phone logs, finding false numbers, then using toll records to uncover real leads. Dozens of them, many connected to Philadelphia. And once the focus shifted to Philadelphia, the hunt became slower and smarter. Surveillance, watching an uncle's residence, watching connections, waiting for one confirmable detail. And according to reporting, the Brileys were in Philadelphia, working under assumed names at a North Philadelphia garage. That's another reminder. Fugitives don't survive on adrenaline alone. They survive by blending into ordinary. A job, a routine, a place to sleep. And then help from an unsuspecting place gave the investigators a break. After his capture, Tuggle provided information indicating the Brileys were in Philadelphia, and he described evidence like a guard badge placed in a tree in Hunting Park, details investigators could verify. Verified details build credibility, and credibility is what turns a hunch into a move. On June 19, 1984, the Briley brothers were captured in Philadelphia. That was 19 days after the escape, 19 days of being out, 19 days of a country watching, and a state running on nerves. And when the Brileys were finally arrested without incident, the manhunt was over. All 6 captured. The Mecklenburg Six was no more. But here's the thing. The end of a manhunt isn't the end of what it does to people. I asked the deputy, when did it feel like it was over? And he said, it felt over when we knew they were all back in custody. But the county didn't go back to normal on a dime, because you can't unlearn what you learned. You can't go back to a time when you believed, that can't happen here. You can't erase the image of a prison van rolling out of a place designed to be escape-proof. You can't erase the feeling of sitting on a mother's house for days, watching nothing, and still feeling like something could happen at any second. And you can't erase what happens when you respond to 100 false sightings, because even the false one teach you something. People were scared enough to call. And in rural areas, people don't call unless they believe it. So even after the manhunt ended, it left something behind. A cultural change. On paper, the manhunt ended when all 6 men were back in custody. But in places like Smith County, that wasn't the real ending. The real ending was doors that stayed locked, porch lights that stayed on, and a way of living that never quite went back to the way it was. Not because people expected it to happen again, but because they understood something they hadn't understood before. Systems fail. Distance doesn't protect you. And once you've seen that happen, you don't assume you're safe anymore. You stay ready. Because in Appalachia, people know there's always another shadow lurking, even when you can't see it. Now next time we'll talk about what came after the capture. The court fights, the execution, the way the Commonwealth tried to close the book, and what it means when the state says, this is finished, but a community still feels the echo. This has been Roots and Shadows, the real Appalachia, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memory. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.